History lectures, and Josh Liller is our history aficionado. And tonight's presentation we have on the atomic bomb for this afternoon. And just when you thought that all he knew about was American history in modern day, he takes a global point of view. So without further ado, a warm welcome for Josh.
Everybody hear me all right?
No.
There we go. Good. There. Microphone's still a little fancy technology. All right, today is August 10th, and so we are a day after the anniversary of the second atomic bomb, August 9th, 1945, when they dropped the second one on Nagasaki, first one on Hiroshima on August 6th, and hence the topic of today's presentation, since we don't have anything Civil War related this month. And I'm going to, not just the two bombs themselves, but they need to be understood in the entire context of the end of the war against Japan and all the other options and everything that's going on at that time period. So, what are the popular myths, as I call them here? What's widely known about the decision and why it was made to drop the bombs? You know, what do people think they know or know through popular documentaries, newspapers, magazine articles on the subject, just what they heard from their parents and grandparents, and or if they experienced it because they were old enough to have that as current events during their lifetime. So one thing that people say is, okay, the atomic bombs were used just to scare the Soviet Union. You know, that was the end of the World War II. Soviet Union was obviously going to be a concern in the post-World War II world. We didn't need to drop them, but we needed to show off to the Soviets that we had this new powerful weapon. Another thing people say is that the Soviets, they were not going to, they actually entered the war against Japan near the very end, right actually about the same day that the second atomic bomb was dropped. And people say, oh, the Soviets were never going to attack the Japanese. They were just sort of paying lip service to it. They're never actually going to come in, but then when we dropped the atomic bombs, that changed their mind. Another thing is that the Japanese surrendered because of that Soviet attack. They weren't going to surrender because of the atomic bombs. They weren't going to surrender because anything the Americans did, but they were afraid of the Soviets, in some manner of speaking. Another thing that's commonly said, Truman was quite fond of quoting this after the war, among other people, that dropping the atomic bombs prevented 500,000 US casualties if we had to invade Japan. There's the perpetual debate is, would the Japanese have surrendered if we didn't drop the bombs? Would they have surrendered because of the Russians? Would they have surrendered because they were being bombed and blockaded and slowly starved to death? Would have an invasion been necessary? Would have that even worked? Would, you know, occupying Japan without having first scared the Japanese with something as powerful as the atomic bomb, would that have even motivated them to surrender? Or would they just, you know, fought every little village, every little hill, any inch that wasn't occupied by an American soldier, but they have contested it, almost like Vietnam, perhaps you could draw as a comparison. So these are, I'm not going to just straight up answer these all at the beginning, they're just sort of thoughts to keep in mind as I go through this, because these are widely known, accurately or inaccurately to different degrees by a lot of people. So first thing we were doing at this point is, having taken the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, they were set up as predominantly as bomber bases to be able to bomb the home islands of Japan, because the Pacific is a really big ocean, even bigger than it seems, and there's a lot of distance you have to cover there. You can't just, nowadays you can fly from California to Japan, but back in World War II you couldn't do that. And so first thing we're doing is bombing Japan. We tried to do what we've predominantly done in Europe, and that's okay. We have all the fancy Norden bomb sites, we have these great bombers, we have essentially air superiority. We're going to just bomb their factories, we're going to bomb their armies, we're going to bomb all these strategic targets. That's difficult even up to this day when we have all the fancy laser-guided precision weapons and so forth, and GPS. Back then, it was much more difficult, even with the fancy technology of the day of the Norden bomb site and so forth, and having the best bomber in the world in the B-29. It was made even more difficult by the nature of Japan. In Europe, Germany is very similar to England or France in terms of how a city would be set up, where a factory is, what a factory looked like. Japan had a much more diversified way. People would work in workshops at home. or mixed in residential neighborhoods. There weren't as many just big factories. You could say, okay, this building right here, this is a factory. We can bomb that. We know that. Japan did not have a lot of information about it. You know, intelligence gathering nowadays, we have satellites, we have spy planes. You didn't have that kind of reconnaissance in World War II. And a lot of people had been to Germany for decades and years up to leading to the war. So you can, oh yeah, you know, we know something about this. There's travel guides, there's maps, there's information, firsthand experience. Much fewer people had been to Japan leading up to the war. There was just a lot less information available about what they should even be looking for there. And to make all of this even worse is the weather in Japan. The jet stream was predominantly encountered by early jets flying high enough to encounter the high-level winds that you have in the jet stream that affects a lot of our weather in North America, how far it's dipping up and down and so forth. But it was also encountered for the first time actually with B-29s flying to Japan, and they're flying at high altitudes, but they're far enough north in where Japan is to actually encounter the jet stream. So you're flying through strong headwinds, heavy wind that can blow you off course, that can screw with your fuel economy, much more difficult to accurately bomb. The weather in Japan is just generally worse than the weather in Germany, much more days of heavy clouds and rain, and just conditions that it's harder to bomb anything accurately and actually hit what you're aiming at. So they started bombing for months and encountered all these difficulties. At this point, the Japanese Air Force was not a difficulty. It had basically been wrecked pretty much, and they basically gave up even trying to intercept the bombers. So they're bombing, but they're not having a lot of success with it. So in from Europe comes this cigar chomping gentleman, Curtis LeMay. LeMay would be sort of a controversial character in history for a variety of reasons. His sort of solve everything by carpet bombing type of attitude, his role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. He actually, one of the characters, if you've ever seen Dr. Strangelove, he's actually the inspiration for one of the more bomb-crazy characters in that. But the guy was actually a very good bomber commander, especially during World War II. He was very competent, men had a lot of confidence in him. If he was going to lead a dangerous bomber mission, he would physically lead it. He wouldn't just send everybody else on the mission. He'd be in that lead bomber saying, you know, I'm not going to send you someplace I wouldn't go, even though I'm an Air Force general. Army Air Force at the time, technically. He would continue doing that even not only in Europe, but in Japan, right up until the point where he got briefed that there was such thing as an atomic bomb. Then, like, I can't really fly just in case you get shot down. That's not information we want getting out. So he comes up with this new strategy. We're going to try firebombing. It's something that had been done a little bit in Europe, actually much more by the British and the Americans. And they would try to use a combination of wind and heat and dry conditions and a lot of incendiary bombs to set fires, create a massive firestorm, burn out huge amounts of a city that more than could be accomplished with a comparable amount of normal bombs. Places like Dresden, Slaughterhouse 5, the Kurt Vonnegut novel dealing with that. Pretty nasty stuff in Europe, but it was made much worse in Japan because in Japan, as a lot of people probably know, they have essentially paper houses. A lot of wood construction, a lot of paper, burns very, very easily compared to a lot of, say, the metal and the stone and the brick you would have in Europe. So this firebombing is much more, the weather is not as conducive to it, but just the conditions of the cities are. And this led to a lot of success. At one point they were firebombing with such success and amounts of bombing, they actually ran out of bombs and they're like, okay, we can't firebomb for a couple of weeks until more ships come from California, bringing some more bombs. The first raid actually was the most successful. They killed 100,000 people in the city of Tokyo, burned out a huge chunk of the city in one night. To carry more bombs, they actually stripped all the extra guns and so forth out of the plane. If you spare crewmen, they're not going to have to worry about shooting any Japanese fighters. The Japanese fighters don't come after them anymore. So they're packing in as many bombs as they can possibly carry, dumping them and lighting Japanese cities on fire. Dozens of Japanese cities during the war got burned. But between March and the end of the war in August, over 100 square miles of Japanese cities were burned, including about half of Tokyo. Nothing quite got to the level that very first night in Tokyo. They hit the part of the city which is the most flammable. The weather conditions were just right to turn into a full-fledged firestorm where lots of people jumped into the river to get away with the fire, and the fire was so hot it boiled the river, that sort of thing. Now, bombing in general of Japan, while significant, did not really persuade the Japanese government. Even when 100,000 people died in one night in Tokyo, the Japanese government kind of shrugged their shoulders and went, yeah, whatever. They weren't really changing their minds about ending the war. The USSBS, which is the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, this was a group that did a study in Europe and then in Japan about the effect of precision bombing and aerial bombing in general on the end of the war. What did we hit? You know, how accurately did we hit it? What kind of impact did it have on the war? Their studies of Japan in particular are quoted a lot after the fact to say, okay, this proves why the Japanese would have surrendered just from bombing after enough time. But part of the problem is they sort of had a bias, a fairly important bias. A lot of the people that were involved in that study had the desire to prove this is how important strategic bombing is, therefore the Army Air Corps needs to be separate from the Army and become the Air Force, because it's a completely separate military department. So they wanted to kind of, anything that they could polish up a little bit and say, see, this proves how important our job is. You know, they would run with it. So it's an interesting but not completely reliable source of information. That's the B-29, biggest, longest range bomber in the world at the end of World War II. Most important for use in Japan because of the distances required, flying initially from China and then mostly in the war from the Marianas, as I mentioned. Much bigger than the B-17s, for example, that did all of the bombing in Europe, but then modern bombers, of course, B-52s and so forth, dwarf this by comparison, as they do most World War II aircraft. While all this bombing was going on, it wasn't the only thing going on. We had basically blockaded Japan to shut down everything that was getting to Japan. The home islands of Japan are very resource poor. They lack oil, they lack metal materials. Basically, most of their stuff besides rice to get raw materials to, you know, they can kind of feed themselves to some extent, but all the raw materials for industry and so forth need to be brought in from outside of home islands. The Dutch East Indies, Southeast Asia area, some of it even from mainland China. Oil being, of course, the most important part because they had pretty much none of that, and it was all coming from places like the Dutch East Indies, which is why at the beginning of World War II they made a point to seize those places. United States submarine warfare had gotten off to a slow start in the war. The torpedoes were really bad. It wasn't really as effective as, say, the U-boats. But as the war went on in Japan, as they perfected the technology, as their submarine commanders got more experience, it became very, very deadly to the Japanese. The Japanese being such it's all about the military mindset. They didn't raid American merchant shipping with their submarines the same way we did. They were always looking for our big fleets with aircraft carriers and battleships, where we were going predominantly after their merchant ships, their tankers, all the key supplies. They never wanted to form convoys very much because they wanted to keep every available warship they have to actually fight American fleets rather than protect their merchant shipping. It was just kind of beneath them. And in 1944, we basically sank half their merchant ships, and they were rapidly running out of ships because we were sinking them at a much faster rate than they could possibly build them. It wasn't just the submarines themselves with torpedoes attacks. We had 13,000 anti-ship mines were dropped in Japanese harbors, Japanese waters, to catch localized shipping, you know, trying to make a night run along the coast of Japan, for example. All toward the end of the war, a lot of it by B-29s when they weren't bombing the cities, they were dropping mines in harbors. There was a flow that we couldn't get to of goods and troops coming from mainland China through Korea, which was Japanese occupied at this point as well, through the Sea of Japan. The entrance to that was too heavily guarded, minefields and aircraft and so forth. But the submarines figured out a way to finally get through there and start attacking Japanese shipping in the Sea of Japan. We finally started attacking ports in Korea, bombing the ships there, dropping mines in the harbors, shutting down a flow of supplies coming in and troops coming in to Japan. Part of the problem was this was very important, but it was coming too late in the war. A lot of the Japanese veteran divisions from Manchuria, when they realized America was getting close, they started rushing them to the home island, so they had the best troops to fight the invasion they expected was coming. And so by the time we were really able to shut down that pipeline, the most important things we wanted to stop had already gotten through. When they weren't supporting something like the Iwo Jima invasion or Okinawa invasion, the United States Navy, with support even of a British fleet of aircraft carriers, was just hitting everything they could possibly think of to hit in Japan along the coastline, ships, cities, what remained of the Japanese Navy, and anything they could find and target and destroy that they thought was useful in the war effort. But this, while very effective in destroying a lot of Japanese resources, it just wasn't really bringing the war to the close at a quick rate. You know, the Japanese had what they absolutely needed in the homeland. They were kind of hunkered down, and they're just like, we know there's an invasion coming. We can tough this out no matter how much we lose, and wait for the invasion to actually come, because that's where we think we can not necessarily defeat it, but win our idea of a victory. Some estimates put it as much as 2 years for a combination bombing blockade with no atomic bomb, no invasion, just trying to strangle Japan essentially before they would believe that would finally, starvation conditions would kick in and it would actually finally end the war solely for that. And that's after 4 years of war, with all going on in Europe and in the Pacific, there was a real feeling in the United States they just wanted the war to end. They wanted to end as soon as possible. Even if you could go on for 2 years with fairly low casualties, that time was just, it was taking too much time, too much money. Even the minor casualties from not having an invasion was just going to take too long. Public will might wear out on money to end the war at any cost. Another important factor leading up to this point was the last major operation before the invasion of Japan was the invasion of Okinawa. It's a small island south of Japan. And it's invaded in April. Fighting went on all the way through June. The importance of this was the biggest island that was close enough to southern Japan that they could take it over, build a bunch of air bases there, and be able to strike with land-based air power besides heavy bombers, with actual P-47s, P-51s, fighter bombers type stuff. We landed 6 divisions, 183,000 Allied troops, predominantly Americans, but there were a few other nations helping a little bit with especially support stuff. Suffered 65,000 casualties, that's killed, wounded, and that's about a third of all the troops that were engaged. Just for the troops, that includes Navy casualties as well from air operations, kamikazes, and so forth. They were facing 120,000 Japanese troops. Basically, probably 110,000 of those died, maybe 10,000 surrendered, probably less than that. There were about 400,000 civilians on the island at the time of the invasion. As much as 150,000 of those possibly died either because they were enlisted by the Japanese, killed by the Japanese, or just caught in the not so friendly fire of being in a war zone. Civilians, not a good place to be. So this 2-to-1 casualty ratio of 120,000 Japanese soldiers causing 65,000 American casualties, that's a very high casualty rate. It was almost the highest of the war. Iwo Jima had actually been a little higher earlier, a few months earlier. Okinawa, the landing part was easy, but then the hills on the island, were heavily festooned with trenches and caves, and it was just brutal fighting to actually dig the Japanese out of every last square foot. So Okinawa's wrapping up, and it's time to figure out how they're going to invade Japan. This hadn't really been put in detailed thought up until 1945, really, because there had been basically hopes that any war with Japan would be decided in a big naval battle or whatever. It would be ended more simply. But then, at this point, it was very clear that wasn't going to happen. The Japanese weren't just going to give up easily, and they expected that an invasion would be necessary to finally force the Japanese to surrender. So, May 1945, MacArthur and Nimitz and their staffs get together. Principal Pacific commander decide what to do. The combination of weather and terrain and aircraft ranges and so forth basically limited what their real options were. The end game, in theory, is capture Tokyo, which is the Japanese capital. Hopefully, even capture perhaps the emperor or the Japanese government. And to get Tokyo without using entirely based carrier air support, you also need the island of Kyushu, which is the southernmost Japanese island. And Okinawa is going to be down here off the bottom of the map. So it's a 2-part invasion plan. You have Olympic, which is the invasion of Kyushu. Okinawa down here sets up Kyushu. Kyushu sets up Honshu, Tokyo area invasion up here. So original plan, Operation Downfall is the overall operation to invade Japan. Olympic is the portion that deals with Kyushu. Coronet is the part that deals with Honshu. The estimated the start dates were planned to be March and December. When they realized, they thought about it some more, and then 4 months apart is pretty tight window of operation, so they bumped it up a month for invading Kyushu. The thing with Olympic, the only delay was really building up the necessary forces to make the invasion. It could kind of move forward or backwards as was necessary. But Coronet, the weather in northern Japan is a lot bigger of an issue, so they couldn't really push it back as you get into summer rains and bad weather, and they wanted to try to get a beachhead set up and a certain amount of progress before the weather turned really nasty in the summer. Otherwise, you're basically pushing this entire invasion off to the fall, and the war's dragging on even longer. Olympic would have been, had it gone forward, it would have been the largest amphibious invasion ever, bigger than D-Day. The plan is not actually to take the entire island of Kyushu. They only needed the southern 1/3 of it. The rest wasn't necessary. They really needed enough space to build the amount of air bases they think they needed, and then sort of a buffer zone to keep the air bases safe. So it's only the bottom 1/3 of the island. And they're going to send in somewhere between 14 and 17 divisions. They were expecting only 6 Japanese divisions, so that's a 3-to-1 ratio, and they don't even think all of them are going to be at the southern part of the island where they're invading. They figure that maybe they'll be spread through the whole island. So, this is a 3-to-1 ratio of invaders to defenders. That's a fairly good military ratio. They're expecting a fanatically hostile population. They expect the Japanese are going to be, very anti-American. The military will persuade them. The American devils need to be, resisted by you because they're going to do horrible things to you. So to that extent, that was expected. Problems. First off, because of the nature of the terrain and the distances involved, what was fairly straightforward, and while we don't really have a lot of other options for our planners, the Japanese kind of came to that same conclusion. They could pretty much figure out, okay, this is where we think the Americans basically have to invade, because anywhere else the invasion is either too far away or it's not a good beach to land on or so forth. And they expected an invasion coming somewhere anyway. So they start shifting what they call their Kwangtung army, a lot of veteran troops in Manchuria, and they're shifting them to Japan. And they're doing this, and they get most of them over before, we get into the Sea of Japan and into Korea to stop that flow of troops. So they've got a lot of reinforcements brought into Japan proper. By the end of the war, from the plans they made in May up till the end of the war, when they were getting intelligence and then the Japanese surrendered and they were able to land and see what was really there, the number of forces on Kyushu had actually tripled up to 900,000 Japanese soldiers, basically putting it on almost a 1-to-1 ratio of Americans to Japanese, and with most of the Japanese concentrated in the southern part of the island, near the beaches where the invasion was going to take place. So the Japanese were essentially ready, as ready as they could be. A lot of the Japanese leaders were, particularly in the military, were convinced that if they could they were ready, they put together a whole manual of how to train civilians to do whatever it needed to be to resist the American invaders, strap a landmine to your back, throw yourself under a tank, things like that. Your entire village all grabs bamboo spears and just charges the Americans. They won't have enough bullets. They figure they can, sacrifice 20 million Japanese like it was nothing. We're going to cause casualties so high that even if we can't defeat the Americans, we'll convince them that the cost in lives is too great for them, because our lives are expendable and theirs are not. The other factor being kamikazes, the Japanese suicide aircraft pilots. This had started in late 1944, had picked up as the war rolled on. A little bit in the Philippines, particularly at Okinawa, was the point where it really became a really big issue and lots of attacks. They were expecting only 2,500 aircraft left in Kyushu. They figured they destroyed a lot. They weren't seeing many challenges to the bombing raids, so they figured there wasn't much Japanese air power left. They know the Japanese are going to throw kamikazes at you, that this is a serious threat that we have to be concerned about, and they're taking steps with improving anti-aircraft guns, putting more fighter aircraft on carriers to deal with this problem. The problem was the planners are expecting 2,500 aircraft. In reality, it was almost double that just on Kyushu, and then even basically as many of them was on the southern island of Japan, scattered through the rest of Japan, was basically that same number over again. The Japanese had stashed a lot of aircraft where they weren't seen, where they couldn't be targeted by air attacks. And they had basically taken any aircraft that they could lay their hands on, even old wooden aircraft that were used for training purposes. And they were just storing them up with just enough fuel that they could go on a one-way trip, because that's all they needed, and attack the Americans when they actually came to invasion. They were specifically waiting for an invasion, not just for a random fleet happening to be close. And they were willing to throw everything they had at that. So when you project this, you have Okinawa with 1,900 kamikaze sorties plus a few veteran pilots who are making normal attacks where you drop a bomb and actually do fly home. They sank 28 ships, damaged 217, that killed 3,300 American sailors. Now, if you remember this map back here, you have the Japanese are flying from up here, up here, flying down to Okinawa, down here. The invasion fleet's offshore, the carriers are offshore. They can put destroyers up here, they can put aircraft waiting up here to intercept where they know the Japanese are coming from. When you get to an invasion here in Kyushu, you've got fleets here, here, here on the island. So the Japanese are only flying, from here or here or here or here, and they're coming in right over the land and immediately into the amphibious fleet that's trying to land on the beaches and bring reinforcements and bring supplies. So you've got much less of a distance they have to cover. They have the ability to use the mountainous terrain on Kyushu to hide their approach. A lot of the wooden aircraft that the Japanese had mustered up from old training aircraft, wood doesn't reflect radar signatures very well like metal does. Proximity anti-aircraft fuses don't detect it very well either. So, and then you're going to have these aircraft coming right over the beach, and kamikaze pilots, especially because they were untrained and nervous, not surprisingly nervous, the first thing they see, they frequently dive right on it. The Navy would put a destroyer out front of their fleet with radar to see when the kamikazes are coming. The kamikazes would dive on this one lone destroyer. Not the best target, but it's the first one they see. Well, now in Kyushu, the first thing they're going to see is all these landing craft hitting the beach, all these troops coming ashore, not the aircraft carriers, not the destroyers, these choice targets full of American troops. So you're looking at a much more serious issue in terms of how dangerous the kamikazes would be and how many people would be dying when they hit a ship. But even not even taking that into factor, just simply taking, okay, this many sorties of kamikazes gave us this kind of statistics. When you take these numbers and project them through this ratio, you're going 11,000 kamikazes. They throw everything they have in Japan at us between the two invasions. You're looking at 155 sunk ships, 950 more damaged, 19,000 dead sailors, and that's not counting if you start hitting lots of loaded transport ships and all the hundreds or thousands of soldiers that are on board of those. So just the kamikazes alone would make the invasion potentially horrific casualties. This is a pair of side-by-side pages from Richard Frank's excellent Downfall book about the end of the war. And you can see, basically, this is the plan, what the expected disbursement of Japanese troops was. These are representing divisions. And then, the American troops are invading. And then side by side, you see this is the situation in reality in August. And you can kind of just see visually the difference, how much worse it actually was than what was expected. So had Olympic gone forward, had Olympic succeeded, second part of Cornet invading Tokyo Bay area, that would have been even larger than Olympic. 25 divisions, including some British ones, some Canadian ones. Now most of the troops invading Kyushu would have been Pacific War veterans. They spent pretty much their entire time fighting the Japanese. For Cornet, just because of the amount of manpower required, they were going to be bringing over veterans almost entirely from Europe. Because of the end of the war with Japan and a certain amount of war weariness with the Americans' population, they implemented a point system. How long you'd been in service, what theaters you were in, how many days of combat you'd seen, losses to your unit, so on and so forth. And based on this point system, they basically gave a partial mid-war demobilization to some of the troops in Europe. You've seen enough war, you can go. The rest of the guys who hadn't been in combat as long, hadn't had the same experiences, were going to get sent over here to the Pacific over 1945 and early 1946 for this second invasion. And even just the planned transfers actually had an impact on the war against Germany. For example, part of the motivation with should we go into Berlin, should we rather beat the Russians to get to Berlin, part of the mindset in making that decision was, if we go to Berlin, that's going to be a nasty city fight. It's going to be a long campaign, which is exactly what happened for the Russians. They had slogging their way in and huge casualties to take Berlin. You know, the American commanders guessed that was what was going to happen to them if they did it. And now you're all these extra casualties, all these units tied up. You're tying up units that we're going to need to be in more or less one piece so we can send it to invade Japan later. And so that factored into it. I mentioned earlier some of the weather issues in terms of the rainy summers, typhoon season, monsoon season, just heavy rainfall in the summer. And that's generally heavy rainfall, especially back then, is an issue. Turning fields to mud is always problematic. But you have the added problem that there are a lot of rice paddies in Kyushu, and especially in this area around Tokyo at this time. It's a lot more urban now. Back then, not so much so. So you have a lot of rice paddies that when you get summer rains, you now have lakes everywhere. They're maybe shallow lakes, but they're very muddy. You put landmines in them that limits how well you can get around. Now you've got everybody getting trench foot because they're walking around all day in wet boots and wet socks. All sorts of problems with that. This was an issue with Kyushu in the first invasion of the Olympic, but it's even bigger issue here because of just the way the rice paddies are congregated. The other problem you see how this map is all green, except for this one brown part right here. Those are mountains, including a mountain probably everybody's heard of called Mount Fuji. A very big mountain range, and that would have been right on the flank of the American troops as they're coming in. So there's concern, okay, how many troops are we going to have to tie up here along the side of our attack to prevent the Japanese from making an attack out of the mountains? Because we don't want to go fight the Japanese in the mountains, because we've done that in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and we know how much of a mess that's going to be. But the Japanese can set up hidden artillery in there, and mortars, and shell supplies, and maybe make a surprise attack in the middle of the night and fall back, just enough to cause some casualties and disrupt us. And they can just do these harassment tactics, wearing down American morale, disrupting supplies, while you're trying to fight what's actually in front of you. So that's another concern and issue with this part of the invasion. Interestingly enough, the Americans also were planning Iron Horse artificial harbors. You may have heard from D-Day they had the Mulberry harbors that they set up because they needed to bring in larger supply ships after D-Day before they could capture French ports to bring in supplies there. They figured that Tokyo Bay would be too mined, too ruined, they couldn't use it, so they needed to make artificial harbors. And so they basically developed advanced mulberries that they call Iron Horses, which have been artificial harbors with block ships and so forth. Some interesting stuff to do with the logistical problems. They would have been set up over here on the coast, and they had to make them extra durable, not just from lessons they learned from D-Day, but also because the weather in Japan was much more stormy. I mentioned there would have been some British involvement and Canadian involvement, possibly even an ANZAC, Australia-New Zealand component. The British were also planning to basically redeploy almost the entirety of the Royal Navy from, they already had some carrier force and so forth in the Indian and Pacific Oceans, but they would have basically, with the end of the war against Germany, transferred everything they had to help support the already massive American Pacific fleet over here. So we had a huge commitment of soldiers and sailors. So while this is going on, really throughout the war, you have a thing called the Manhattan Project, which is the design of the atomic bomb. It got started predominantly by a couple physicists, Einstein, Liller, I don't know how to pronounce his name, I'll admit that. They put together a letter that said, hey, Einstein was a refugee from Germany, and there was awareness that the German physicists had some concept of some kind of using atomics stuff to develop a nuclear bomb that would have been very destructive. So a couple physicists, they approach Einstein because they say, hey, Einstein's better known and more famous than any of us, so if we show him what we're thinking, he agrees with us, signs off saying, yeah, I agree with these guys, we should take this seriously. Help motivate FDR to put forward this project to study, develop a atomic bomb. The whole project, because of a combination of secrecy and security, was spread around different areas. The three main places, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Hanford, which is up in Washington State, and Los Alamos, New Mexico. They were working on different aspects of the project in different places. Throughout the war, I believe the first successful reaction was in 1942, and then it was a matter of, okay, we know we can make a boom. How do we control this boom? The total project during the war costs $1.845 billion, which actually seems like a lot. Was actually only 9 days of normal World War II spending. They put together a targeting committee once they figure, okay, the bomb is going to work, pending one final test, but we've got everything coming together. We can project about August 1st it's going to be ready. At this point, we know that the war against Germany is almost over. We originally developed a bomb to possibly use against Germany before they could develop one and use it on us, but we're going to use it on Japan since we don't need it on Germany. And especially since the Japanese don't seem like they're going to surrender. So they put together a group of soldiers and scientists to try to figure out how we should use this bomb. The conclusion was that it should be used on places that would affect Japanese willpower, but were also military in nature. They didn't just want to blow up a city. What it boiled down to really was there were some alternatives about how you might use the bomb. Okay, maybe we should just make a demonstration, and certainly some of the scientists were in favor of that. The thing is, there's a lot of concerns with that, in that, first off, you can promise a demonstration, everyone's watching for your big demonstration, you set off your still very imprecise atomic explosion, and nothing happens because something just goes wrong. It would be pretty embarrassing. Not really, it had kind of the opposite effect of what you're trying to show this powerful weapon by having it be a dud. You could say, hey, we're going to bomb this place, you better get everybody out there if you want to live. The Japanese might could say, okay, the civilians go out, all the POWs go in. You could set it off on perhaps an uninhabited island, but giant explosion where it's knocking over a few palm trees doesn't really convince anyone very much. The mindset of hitting a city was, when you hit a city, you see just how much of a devastation is left. But the idea was not just to hit any city that was unbombed. They did want to specifically hit something that was unbombed, because if you've already burnt down half of Tokyo, blowing up ruins isn't going to make much more of an impression than blowing up a desert island. But they wanted to be a place that had some significance, not just a random city, but something where there was more justifiable use of such a powerful weapon. So, July, they test what's called Trinity. There were two different types of bombs. They were less confident about one of them, so they needed to test that kind. And it worked out really well. One of the lead scientists on the project is this gentleman, J. Robert Oppenheim. He had some interesting hobbies on his side, one of which was studying Hindu mythology. And when the bomb successfully goes off and there's this giant fireball, a mushroom cloud in the sky, he said that the thought that occurred to him was a quote from Hindu mythology, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Oft-quoted, probably pretty apt, given the power that it unleashed. Truman had gone to Europe to confer with Churchill and Churchill's successor and Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, plan out post-war things in Germany, and then details about the Pacific War. He gets news there that the bomb is a success, that it's ready to be used, gives his approval. While he's there, he also mentions it sort of casually to Stalin. He goes, "Oh yeah, you should use it against the Japanese." What he didn't know was that Stalin was actually already aware that the bomb existed due to Soviet spies, the kind of thing that would help the Soviet nuclear arms race after the war, by getting spies in there and espionage and so forth. But while the Russians at this point were nowhere near, much to Stalin's unhappiness, nowhere near having a bomb ready, they at least knew theoretically what it could do and that the Americans were working on it. So Stalin's given his approval for what that was even worth, that the bomb should be used on the Japanese. And Truman's given the go-ahead on it as well. So early August, stuff's been shipped over, bomb's ready to go, and as soon as there's a good day of weather, August 6th, Hiroshima, that's the aftermath. they dropped what was a uranium bomb. As I mentioned, there are two types of bombs. The uranium bomb used uranium type of metal element, and it was, they just referred to it as the gun design. They would take uranium and they would shoot it down a tube inside the bomb into another piece of uranium, and that causes a chain reaction and a massive explosion. The reason why Hiroshima was targeted, number one, it was one of the biggest cities not yet hit, but it was also a military headquarters. There were 40,000 Japanese soldiers in the town at the time. In fact, if he hadn't been away on a meeting, the general in charge of defending Kyushu would have been there as well at the time the bomb went off. They aimed the bomb for a bridge in the middle of town. Basically, it did not actually hit the ground. It was designed to go off in mid-air at a certain altitude for maximum explosive power, and basically right on target, massive devastation. The number of casualties is a great deal of speculation and study, hard to nail down, especially with all the radiation deaths and poisoning and so forth afterwards. So you can't get one really fixed number, but 90,000 to 160,000 is sort of the ballpark estimate, probably on the higher end of the spectrum. The plan, of course, was not just drop one and see what happens. These were designed to end the war as soon as possible, so there was no, let's drop a bomb, see what happens. Well, I guess nothing's happened. Let's drop another bomb, see what happens. It was, just start dropping them as soon as you could, one after another, and until the Japanese gave in. Basically, the mindset of every tool that you have, you're going to use it as soon as you can, to the maximum effectiveness that you can to end the war as soon as you can. So the next bomb actually wasn't planned to go until August 11th. However, due to a bad weather forecast, they moved it up. The target was actually not intended to be Nagasaki. It was a town called Kokura. The weather was really bad there, and so they went to their backup target. The bombing actually should have been aborted. The aircraft had some fuel pump problems. They had explicitly been ordered not to use radar for bombing because it was less accurate. You'll be able to see what you're dropping the bomb on, so you can make sure it's on target or you don't drop it. But when you tell people, hey, we have this new super bomb, but don't use it under these circumstances, fly it back home, and it's kind of like, I don't want to land with this thing and have it blow up on me. So the pilots were inclined to drop it one way or the other, which they did. As a result, their aiming point in Nagasaki was a little off target. Nagasaki is a port, which was the secondary value. It was one of the biggest unbombed shipyards in Japan, so it was very important to the war effort in that regard. But it's sort of built into the foothills of mountains, and so the bomb sort of came down in those foothills, and it kind of blocked some of the blast, which is one of the reasons why the casualties, you'll notice, are significantly lower, not because Nagasaki was necessarily much smaller than Hiroshima, but because of just the way the bomb went off relative to the mountains around it. This bomb was a plutonium bomb, different element, and it basically, this was an implosion bomb. You put plutonium in a big circle like a soccer ball, and then you crush it together, and that causes a chain reaction. This was the one they also they tested at Trinity, that they were less confident about how it would work. Uranium was more reliable. They thought it would be more powerful, but plutonium was a lot easier to produce, so that you could make a lot more plutonium bombs. You just kind of had to hope they would work. So this is a picture. Is it Hiroshima? Is it Nagasaki? It's actually neither. This is actually what Tokyo looked like after a firebombing. You can kind of see massive devastation, massive devastation. In terms of devastation, the difference is how many bombs, how many bombers, and whether or not things blow in the dark afterwards. While all these atomic bombs were going off, you had what's been called August Storm, which is the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and an island off the coast, Sakhalin, which was half Japanese, half Soviet. The U.S. had been trying to persuade the Soviets to enter the war for a little while. Originally, they figured that the Chinese could be used going on at the same time that the Americans were going to stage an invasion. The Chinese army would make sure that those several million Japanese, half of their entire army actually, was still in China, still fighting the Chinese since 1937, and that the Chinese would tie them down. But it had become very apparent that the Chinese army was pretty much worthless, and so this led to, hey, can we persuade the Russians, who have a very useful army, to come in and make sure that the Japanese can't send any reinforcements. The reinforcements they were trying to stop kind of came too late because the Japanese kind of figured out what was going on, as I mentioned a little earlier. But once given the Soviets would say, hey, you can get, that you're half of your island back, you can get certain rights related to railroads and so forth back in exchange for you entering the war. And the agreement they made was 90 days after Germany surrendered, after the war in Europe was over, the Soviets would join the war against Japan. The Soviets actually lived right by this promise, and basically 90 days, almost to the exact day, they entered the war. They had been shuttling troops and tanks and so forth eastward since early 1945, once it became clear that the war with Germany was nearing an end. They lived up to their part of that bargain, actually. And they had, Stalin had no reason not to go to the war. He had everything to gain by physically holding things that he'd been promised, because if he wasn't physically holding them, he was worried that maybe the United States might change their minds. Well, we're not going to give that back to you after all. He also, in addition to attacking the Japanese in Manchuria and that island off the coast, there's also another chain of islands called the Kurils. They run from eastern Russia down to the northern end of Japan. The Russians sort of had a claim to some of the northern ones, but they wanted to have all of them to be able to guarantee access to their port in Vladivostok. So they just went ahead and invaded all of those while they were at it, in some cases to some pretty tough fighting. And the Japanese to this day are still kind of grumpy about the whole thing, because it was technically the Soviets overstepping the boundaries of what the Americans had agreed with them on, but the issue still hasn't been resolved to this day. So the Russians attack, not a huge numerical superiority over the Japanese troops, but their troops are all veterans, while all the veteran troops from Japan had pretty much been sent back to the home islands for the American invasion. Japanese had not a lot of air power there. They were massively outgunned in terms of tanks and artillery, and the terrain in Manchuria was favorable to the Russian attack, very wide open. There are some mountains and so forth there, but generally it was perfect ground for the Soviet army to attack. It wasn't amphibious, which was one of the problems Americans always had to deal with. So even 1.6 million Soviets, only 35,000 casualties, comparing to 1.2 million Japanese, 80,000 of which killed or wounded, and then most of the rest captured at the end of the war on top of that. Some people say, oh, well, if the Soviets had so much success in Manchuria, wouldn't the invasion of Japan have been so easy as well? Well, as I mentioned, the veteran troops had gone back to Japan to wait for us, not for the Soviets. And again, the terrain and the not being amphibious invasion and so forth, really played into the Soviets' strong suit of being able to have this operation be very successful. There were places where the Japanese put up fanatical, bloody resistance, so it wasn't all a cakewalk. It was just such a wide area that it was able to work very well. The Japanese were concerned that this was going to happen. They pretty much, earlier in the year, the Soviets had renounced that they were not going to renew their non-aggression treaty with the Japanese. Technically, they attacked before the treaty expired, which some people will complain about to this day as being poor diplomacy on their part. The Japanese, having spent a lot of time leading up to World War II sort of playing people off diplomatically pretty well, were played really badly themselves by the Soviets. They felt that the Soviets they could keep the Soviets out of the war, at least for a long time, and that as long as the Soviets were out of the war, they sort of had an option. They might be able to play for some kind of negotiated settlement with the Americans. That wasn't really ever going to happen, and the Soviets just sort of, gave them lip service and stalled them out until they were ready to attack. So we have the atomic bombs have been dropped, the Soviets have attacked, Japan finally surrenders. Well, how did that process go about and why? Americans had the Allies in general had demanded unconditional surrender of both Germany and Japan. There was this mindset after World War I where Germany just kind of surrendered and there was no occupation of Germany, there weren't anybody in German grounds. oh, we weren't really ever defeated. You know, the politicians stabbed us in the back, the Jews stabbed us in the back, whatever. You know, lots of excuses used by Hitler and other people to justify things, to why they needed revenge or were really defeated or so forth, justify another war, which became World War II. And so there was this mindset that we are going to require these people to really surrender. They're going to be occupied. We're going to make sure that their, you know, totalitarian, fascist, militaristic mindset is essentially scrubbed out of their culture and out of their government, so we never have to fight a World War III again against these same people that we just fought in Japan, a world war, against Germany, 2 world wars. That actually worked out fairly well. You know, Japan is pretty peaceful. Germany hasn't started any wars or been involved in any wars since then. So arguably that was the correct call. Well, the Japanese, unsurprisingly, were not willing to surrender with no conditions whatsoever. They were, for the most part, by this point late in the war, ready to surrender with some conditions. So this leads to one of the big controversies. Oh, the Japanese would have surrendered if we promised them to keep the emperor safe. We will allow you to keep the emperor, because that was one of their concerns, that the emperor would be killed, the emperor would be punished, or just removed from power. He wouldn't have done any direct punishment. And there was a sort of semi-deity view of the emperor. He was kind of divine, and he was this huge symbolic thing beyond the level of, say, what the British nowadays equate with their royalty, of much bigger symbol and role culturally to them. Even though he didn't have very much actual direct power, it was more of a symbolic and advisory role. But it was very important to the Japanese to preserve him. But this was, you have to understand the nature of the Japanese government at this point is that the military essentially had as much power, if not more power, than the civilians. Now, we're used to here in America, the military has always been subservient to the civilian side. The president is commander-in-chief, the army has to answer to him, and so forth. Basically, when the army and navy weren't fighting with each other, because there was an inter-service rivalry there that makes the Army-Navy football game look like a cakewalk, the military was really dominating the civilian side of things. And so while maybe the prime minister was a civilian, or actually possibly retired military, was saying, okay, as long as they preserve the emperor, we'll surrender. The army guys and the navy guys who were in the government, they said, no, we need to preserve the emperor, but we also say no war crimes trials, especially since they were the guys whose butts would have been on the line in a war crime trial. We won't be occupied. We won't say we're sorry. Some of them said, hey, we've had Korea since 1900, so we're not giving that back. And also, we'll end the war, and we'll give up the Dutch East Indies and whatever, or we're not going to give up this stuff. So these were all conditions where, yeah, the Japanese probably would have said, if we put that forward, they would have said, okay, yep, we'll end the war on these conditions. But these were conditions that were completely unacceptable to the Allies from a mindset of preventing another world war, number one. Number two, that whole, we're not going to let you off easy after you sneak attacked us at Pearl Harbor. There was that mindset as well. It just wasn't going to be accepted. So the atomic bombs are dropped, and there's actually a bit of a slow reaction to them. By the time the second bomb was dropped 3 days after the first, the Japanese government hadn't even met. They haven't even gone, no, we had a giant atomic explosion over one of our cities. Perhaps this should cause us to rethink things. It was a couple days before the army dispatched anyone to investigate. It wasn't until after the second bomb the government even got together to just discuss what was happening. So there was a little of a slow reaction. The second bomb being 3 days after the first, that actually had worked into their mindset that, man, these guys are dropping things 3 days apart. Now we're going to get another one 3 days from now. How many of these bombs do they have? It's not a one-off, scare you weapon. It's something that they have a lot more, coming at us. And there was the feeling that this bomb had kind of, changed how things were going to be. That, one bomb, this big, could rule out the need to actually physically invade Japan, because you can just now bomb us into the ground more than you could before. So this unsettles the Japanese. They know about the invasion of Manchuria as well and the Soviets' involvement, but they don't really know how badly it's going there. They just know, well, that option's off the table. We'll have to deal with them now too. So the government meets, they can't come to a conclusion. The foreign minister and the prime minister go to meet with the emperor, and he says, well, you should end the war. And they say, okay, we'll end the war and preserve, with the only requirement that we will preserve you. And because this is opinion coming from you, we think we can make the military go along with it. So the military is like, okay. The senior military advisors say, well, we'll broadcast through, diplomatic channels that we'll surrender on the condition the emperor is preserved. And the Americans think about this and they go, well, that's still a condition. So they kind of give back a reply. They try to word things specifically up to this point in Potsdam Declaration, in Truman's VE Day speech. We are requiring the unconditional surrender of the Japanese military. We're not going to make the people enslaved. We're not going to kill the civilians. We only need the Japanese military unconditionally to surrender. So they send back a response to this surrender offer. They sort of make some vague assurances about, whatever the Japanese, the will of the people will decide what kind of government they get. And, you can kind of read between the lines that meant that the Japanese people would like to keep their emperor, they would. But it wasn't a promise. They were still technically surrendering unconditionally. So there's still some uncertainty about that. They're bickering again in the Japanese government. They meet with the emperor again, and the emperor finally kind of puts his foot down and said, we need to surrender. The general was supposed to have been in Hiroshima the day of the bombing and happened to, for his sake, be lucky to be away, had gone back and seen the devastation, and he goes to meet with the government at the same meeting. And before the emperor speaks, they let him speak. It's like, tell us about how, minor this is and how we can fight the Americans. You've seen this firsthand as they've bombed your headquarters. You're in charge of our defenses when they invade Kyushu. And he goes, no, we should surrender. And that was one of the mindsets that sort of started to change the opinions that maybe you really should surrender. When the emperor put his foot down essentially for a second time, even though he didn't have technical power in the government, his opinion was so respected that it was willing to overcome the reluctance of the military to go along with it. The emperor made a recording that they announced was going to be played the next day at noon, just broadcast throughout Japan. The emperor was actually going to speak and let everyone know, we're surrendering, this is why we're surrendering, to let all the people in Japan know, in addition to sending it to the Americans. And some junior officers in the military tried to actually stage a coup. They were going to overthrow the civilian governments. They were going to protect the emperor from these bad influences and try to continue the war. But the senior Japanese military officials basically sandbagged them and tried to dissuade them and made their life difficult and basically foiled this coup attempt, because at this point they're like, we'd like to fight on, but we're not going to go against the will of our emperor. Even young hotheads think otherwise. So the broadcast goes off without the coup. The coup is unsuccessful. The emperor broadcast. People in Japan, almost to a man, had never heard his voice before. They'd seen his picture, they'd seen him before, maybe at a review in a parade or handing out medals or something, but they never actually heard his voice. So it was a really just shocking experience to just bring home how serious this moment was. So we go back to the decision to why did we drop these bombs? Well, how many casualties were we going to have? I talked about the kamikaze casualties earlier, the changes in the ratio of casualties from Okinawa and how that could be comparable to Kyushu because of the terrain there and so forth. There were so many numbers that were kicked around at the time in different planning meetings. They're kicked around in a variety of books on the subject. Some talk about what they were estimating for the whole campaign, some just for Operation Olympic, some for 90 days of the invasion or 30 days of the invasion. All sorts of numbers kind of flying all over the place. But there's for all these, the generals and these different committees and stuff that were studying the issue and what has been studied in retrospect with the statistics that we have now, the big question becomes, what did President Truman, when he authorized using the bombs, what did he actually know? He loved to quote afterwards, he was saving 500,000 American lives, referring to an invasion. Depending on how you crunch the numbers, that's truthful. Whether or not he was expecting that at the time is another matter. Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War giving speeches toward the end of the war, did throw around that number. Whether or not he was basing that number on any hard numbers given to him from committees and generals and so forth is another matter. Whether Truman ever saw a report specifically giving that number is also in doubt. But Truman did know that there was going to be an issue of casualties, and using that number after the fact, without whether he knew it at the time, was just a good way to defend his decision. What's the mindset behind using the bomb? Was it revenge for Pearl Harbor? Was it to intimidate the Soviets? How much is basically was dropping the bomb on the Japanese not necessarily about forcing a surrender? I mean, you probably can't completely divorce that from it. There was a lot of mindset of revenge for Pearl Harbor at the time. To say it was dropped solely for that reason, I'd say was wrong. As one author put it, it assigns malice to Truman that is outside of his character. Does intimidating the Soviets play into the factor? It certainly doesn't rule against it. I mean, if you're thinking, well, there's another reason why we might do it. It might, they could be. At this point, though, it wasn't real clear exactly how much of an issue the Soviets were going to be. Obviously they were difficult to deal with, but a lot of the real issues didn't start to crop up until a couple of years later and really kick off the Cold War. So that surely factors in, but it wasn't really a primary reason. Almost the reason comes down to a why is more the question of why not. We look back on this question of the atomic bombs with decades and decades of hindsight. We saw what it did to the Cold War and the fears of the Cuban Missile Crisis and duck and cover and Tsar Bomba and fallout and Chernobyl and the Fukushima reactor and radiation poisoning and all the horrors that we know about now. But back then in 1945, with the first atomic bombs, this level of all the dark side of atomics was not remotely appreciated. There were quotes saying that Oppenheimer at one point said, I think about 20,000 people will be killed by the bomb. There were people on the soldiers or scientists in the know that said that nobody's going to die of radiation because anybody close enough to get hurt by the radiation is going to die in the blast anyway. That there would be no lingering radiation effects, things like that. So even a year or two after the fact, they didn't know. It was so unknown to the point that George Marshall, who was the head of the army at the time, if the atomic bombs hadn't persuaded the Japanese to surrender and they had to go ahead with the invasion that they were planning and that had been greenlit by Truman before the atomic bombs, his plan was to stop bombing cities. He wanted to stop bombing cities and he wanted to save up all the atomic bombs, and then right before we invade Kyushu, we're going to nuke every beach that we're going to invade. And then that whole fallout radiation thing on the American troops landed would have been a little, George Marshall would not have a good legacy if that had happened. And really, back to the why not, I sort of referenced this earlier, is World War II was such a nasty, especially World War II, above most wars in general, but World War II in particular, it was so nasty, the overall casualties were so high, there was just this mindset of, as soon as you have a weapon, you use that weapon to its maximum effect, as soon as possible, as often as possible, to make the war end as soon as possible. You're sparing, you're not figuring necessarily the exact, if we drop this bomb, we'll save this many lives. If we do this, we'll save this many lives. Days and thousands of lives and things like that. You're just, they didn't know if the Soviets were going to attack. Even though they knew the Soviets were going to attack, they were expecting the Soviets to attack as agreed upon. They didn't know what kind of impact that would have. They didn't know if one bomb would persuade them that two bombs would. They would just hit them with everything we got, and the sum of it will hopefully persuade them to stop, which essentially it did. There's a lot of, that's George Marshall, by the way, as I call it, nightmares prevented. Besides the possibility, for example, of an invasion of nuclear bombs on the beaches, before that invasion, George Marshall was also ready to use poison gas on the Japanese, chemical warfare. The Japanese had used some chemical warfare against the Chinese occasionally. so it was not even necessarily unprecedented. Hadn't been used at all in Europe by either side, except in gas chambers of the Holocaust, of course. But George Marshall was figuring, hey, we're firebombing their cities, we're using flamethrowers and napalm on their soldiers. How much worse is poison gas going to be, and how many American lives is it going to save if we use it? I mentioned the tactical nukes. There was something called Operation Zipper. It was a British plan. Churchill, if the war kept going, Churchill wanted to physically be in possession of Singapore by the time the fighting stopped. So in September, he was going to land in Malaysia and retake Singapore. And to fight the 77,000 Japanese that were dug in to defend it. The beach that they had picked out was not well defended, but the invasion force was on the way when the war ended. They figured, hey, let's land there anyway just to practice. And they found out the beach was not quite as good as they were expecting, even though it wasn't well defended. So it would have been slow physically getting things ashore. It could have ended up in a big bloody invasion there, taking Singapore over and bloody. So that's a campaign that was prevented from happening. You have an invasion of Hokkaido. I haven't mentioned anything about the Americans talking about invading Hokkaido. Hokkaido is the northernmost of the four main Japanese islands. It was actually the Russians who were planning to invade that, not with any mention of it to the Americans, really. They just figured after they had taken the Kuril Island chain and the southern half of Sakhalin Island, they were going to invade throw a few regiments or divisions in there in Hokkaido and take that. Had it gone ahead, probably would have succeeded. The Japanese weren't really expecting that sort of thing from the Russians. They didn't have a lot of troops up there, weren't in a position to really get more reinforcements, but it's a pretty mountainous island. Casualties didn't bother the Soviets very much, especially at this point, so they probably would have succeeded after another bloody invasion and mountain fighting. And then you would have had a post-war occupation of one of the Japanese islands, and given the population of Hokkaido at the time, and given what the Germans did to, or what the Russians did to Germany, what they did to Manchuria, you're looking at the northernmost island of Japan basically being stripped of everything of value and sent back to the Soviet Union, and massive rape, and probably 400,000 dead civilians, just because the Soviets happened to be there for a while. Because that's what the Soviets did when they occupied you after the war. Right at the end of the war, on August 11th, you have 2 atomic bombs already dropped. The US strategic bombing, they'd been studying what had happened in Europe, and they'd sent their findings over to Pacific Bomber Command, and they said, hey, we should bomb their railroads. It would be a really good idea. And the Japanese railroad system was actually fairly fragile. You know, this was more apparent after the war was over, but not really apparent during the war because of how little was known about Japan. Had they started bombing the limited railroad system, you would have really gridlocked transportation within Japan, coinciding to all the shipping in Japan being shut down, and not a whole lot of, didn't exactly have gas-drive automobiles around very much either. You actually have, during the US occupation in late 1945, early 1946, you had a very poor year of rice harvesting. So you had massive influx of supplies for the American occupation troops just to feed the Japanese with the war over. Without the American troops there to feed the Japanese, a similar rice disaster combined with a complete gridlock of Japanese transportation, you could have had massive Japanese starvation in late 1945 and early 1946. You could have had more Japanese dying of starvation from that simply than, even if the emperor had seen, all my people are starving to death now and I want to surrender at this point without the atomic bombs, you may have had more dead Japanese just from that starvation alone than you did from the atomic bombs. Factoring into a continuation of the war, you had a typhoon in October 1945. Typhoons are the Pacific equivalent of hurricanes, oftentimes bigger actually. One that direct hit Okinawa after the war, October 1945, would have been less than a month before the invasion of Kyushu, and Operation Olympic would have massively disrupted the invasion, maybe pushed it back a couple months. All the ships and sailors and soldiers on shore, having their tents and stuff, torn up, and all the problems that would cause, ships sunk in typhoons. The Philippines were a major staging operation, especially for where all the wounded were going to go to be treated before being sent back to the States after they were evacuated from Japan. So April 1946, right as the war was would have been preparing for the coronet in the second invasion, you would have had another typhoon that hit Manila, which would have heavily disrupted and possibly killed more troops there just from if operations were still going on. You had just the basic civilian casualties on average, possibly, depending on the source, upwards of 100,000 civilians, non-Japanese, non-soldiers, were dying from all war-related causes of supplies and all the being in a war zone problems that you had going on average per month. So it's quite possible that had the war gone on for a couple months more without any kind of invasion, you would have had as many casualties there from just other causes, from not even Japanese deaths, as you had from the atomic bombs. You had several thousand Americans dying even on low operations just from disease and accidents and just normal bombing of Japan and so forth. They're adding to your casualty count. So if you're looking at it by sheer numbers of this exactly many Japanese died, a few more months you're possibly exceeding that number already. So the atomic bomb is not necessarily even the worst possible outcome in sheer numbers. This is Hiroshima today. If you're lucky, this guy doesn't come around too often. This is the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park. This is the Children's Memorial there. This is in the area that was hit by the atomic bomb. You can see this dome in the background, which is right here, which has been preserved. It was actually it's nicknamed the Atomic Dome for not surprising reasons, because it was the closest building to the center of the Hiroshima explosion to have survived. Godzilla's on here because he came out in 1950s. Godzilla, the character, fictional character of course, but he's a lizard mutated to destructive portions by atomic testing, who's destroying Japan. That's symbolism. If you watch a lot of Japanese fiction, Japanese anime, some of it's very straightforward, like Grave of the Fireflies, that is people in World War II or living in, some of them dealing with the atomic horrors, and some of it's symbolic, a lot of post-apocalyptic stuff that stems from that mindset, that experience of having atomic bombs dropped on you and nobody else.